Okay, right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Zoom event with Luke Harding, who will be talking about his latest book, Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem and Russia's Remaking of the West. Here we go, which you'll probably all have had a copy. Luke is a journalist, writer and award-winning correspondent with The Guardian. He's reported from Delhi, Berlin and Moscow and covered wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria. Between 2007 and 2011, he was The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. The Kremlin deported him from the country in the first case of its kind since the Cold War. I know you've got a great story about that, Luke. In 2014, he won prestigious James Cameron Prize. He's the author of several books, most recently the #1 New York Times bestseller, Collusion, Secret Meetings, Dirty Money and How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. Other titles include A Very Expensive Poison, The Assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, and Putin's War with the West. The Snowden Files, The Inside Story of the World's Most Wanted Man, and Mafia State, How One Reporter Became an Enemy of the Brutal New Russia. His books have been translated into 30 languages. 2 have been made into Hollywood movies. DreamWorks, The Fifth Estate, based on WikiLeaks, written by David Lee, was released in 2013. Director Oliver Stone's biopic Snowden, adapted from the Snowden Files, appeared in 2016. A stage version of A Very Expensive Poison premiered in 2019 at the Old Vic Theatre in London, written by Lucy Prebble. It won the Critics' Circle Award for Best New Play. So, what it says on your book, which I think is terribly powerful: no terrorist group has deployed a nerve agent in a civilian area or used a radioactive mini bomb in London. The Kremlin has done both. Welcome, Luke. Please tell us more about this absolutely fascinating book.
Well, Cheryl, thank you. It's very good to be with you. I think last time I was with you in the kind of physical world a couple of years ago for my book, A Very Expensive Poison. I actually visited the bookshop. And do you remember those days?
I do. The good old days when we could meet and shake hands. Yeah.
I know. I mean, obviously, all you wonderful people out there are real, but it's a slightly different experience. And before curtain was up, we were kind of bemoaning what's happened to the literary season. I mean, compared to everything else in the world, it's nothing. It's sort of trivial. But I'm very glad that you've managed to arrange this, and thanks to everyone for beaming in, because we've got to find kind of new and innovative ways to connect. And reading, publishing, thinking is more important than ever, I think, especially now. So maybe for those of you who sort of don't know me, maybe I'll just kind of reprise a little bit, which is that, as Cheryl says, I'm a kind of journalist on the Guardian newspaper, and am or was a career foreign correspondent based out of New Delhi and then Berlin and then Moscow. I arrived in Moscow in 2007, having had a pretty torrid decade, having done wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was the sort of Guardian's war and death guy for quite a long time. And I sort of thought that when we arrived, when I say we, I mean me, my wife Phoebe, and our 2 then quite sort of small kids, that we were sort of adaptable, we were versatile, we were good at languages. I didn't speak Russian, but I'd started learning it before I got posted, and was very diligent, did my homework, and I speak Russian now. And I thought wrongly that Russia was under Vladimir Putin, who'd been in power for 2 presidential terms at that point. I thought that it was a semi-democracy, that clearly after the whole Soviet legacy was not a full-blown democracy, but was heading sort of slowly in that direction. And in fact, the reverse was true. What was happening under Putin was that Putin had sort of taken the dimmer switch, and he'd made everything darker. He'd squashed civil society. He'd got rid of real sort of genuine political opposition, both in the parliament and from TV. State media was absolutely under his thumb. And more than that, we were seeing the murky assassination, I guess, of critics of the regime, of him personally, both in Russia and abroad. And my arrival in Moscow coincided with really one of the most famous cases of the 21st century, which was the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, with, you'll all remember, with a radioactive cup of tea in a London hotel by two assassins sent from Moscow carrying radioactive polonium. And this whole episode cast a shadow over my professional life. I mean, I spent 4 years trying to get to the bottom of this, unsuccessfully as it would turn out, and also our personal life, because we had a sort of series of break-ins at our family apartment in Moscow, which were sinister and unwelcome and unpleasant and very obvious. And we were advised by the British Embassy that the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, which Putin had headed before he became Prime Minister and President, had done it and had bugged our flat. And I remember talking to one senior diplomat inside the embassy's padded, secure room, which looked like a music studio, which the Russians hadn't bugged. And he basically said, "Terribly sorry, old chap, nothing we can do." And I said, "Well, look, might Her Majesty's government remove these bugs?" To which the answer was no. And then I sort of said, "Well, look, have they got video?" To which the answer was probably yes. And sort of have a biscuit, I mean, there was nothing the embassy could do. And we basically were surveilled for that whole period. And the reason I mention it is because it became important to understanding the Russian context and to some of my reporting down the road, because my sort of career in Moscow stopped short in 2011. I'd come back to do a book on WikiLeaks, flew back to Moscow, was detained at the airport, flipped back and deported. But I spent the next few years back in the UK looking at Russian interference in the UK and in other countries, and also trying to pursue what had happened to Litvinenko. And what was interesting was that some of the things I'd observed in Russia that Vladimir Putin had perfected domestically, like trolling, like using paid bots of cynical students to sit in an airless office and to type comments on Russian media space, they were being wheeled out internationally. So that I noticed that my newspaper, The Guardian, and other newspapers too, were suddenly being flooded with pro-Putin comments. And this was the beginning of this, what you might call a kind of weaponized information campaign to mess with the heads of citizens, of voters. And meanwhile, other critics were dying. I mean, one person who was Alexander Litvinenko's boss, Boris Berezovsky, famous oligarch who fell out with Putin, fled to London in 2000. He was found mysteriously hanged in his ex-wife's bathroom in Surrey. And the list of critics, journalists, oppositionists killed was getting bigger and bigger. And I wrote my last book by one, a very expensive poison, off the back of the public inquiry, which happened in 2015 and 2016, when the evidence into Litvinenko's astonishing murder collected by Scotland Yard was finally made public after almost 8.5 years, and it laid out this astonishing trail by these bungling assassins who left a ghostly trace of polonium wherever they went, in hotels, in cars, in boardrooms, even in a strip club that they went to in Mayfair, in Jermyn Street. It was astonishing. And the reason I mention this is because it's all too kind of horribly relevant with what's still happening in Russia, even in the last couple of weeks, because we've seen, I'm sure you're aware, we've seen the almost certain poisoning, to my mind, of Alexei Navalny, who's a very prominent Russian opposition critic. I met him shortly before I was deported out of Russia. He is everything the sort of 60-something KGB guys who run the Russian government are not. He's tall, he's handsome, he's highly intelligent, and also he gets the modern world. I mean, he does these investigations on a kind of video channel you can watch them, the subtitle in English. They're witty, they're blistering, they expose top-level Kremlin corruption. And his reward for all this was when he was in Siberia, week before last, meeting with opposition people, someone put what looks like a nerve agent into his tea at a cafe in Tomsk in Siberia. I've been to Tomsk. And he collapsed on the plane, was in a medically induced coma, was medevaced on Saturday to Berlin. And just a couple of hours ago, before I came to sort of meet you all, I did a story for The Guardian with the Russian government saying that they would not investigate Navalny because they couldn't find any evidence that he'd been poisoned, and there was nothing to see. And Vladimir Putin's press spokesman, someone called Dmitry Peskov, whom I know well, saying the idea that Putin might be to blame is ludicrous. It's not serious. It's noise, is what he called it. And with all of these cases of murder, whether it's Navalny, whether it's Sergei Skripal, poisoned 2 years ago in Salisbury, or whether it's Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, what happens is essentially that it's pretty clear that, to my mind, the FSB, the Russian spy agency, would have been behind this. But first, the evidence is destroyed. Then, Russian government says there are no facts, and then it presents a kind of a counter version to the world, which is fictitious but serves to kind of confuse the gullible and the foolish. So in Litvinenko's case, it's that he wasn't worth killing. He didn't have any secrets. The Brits did it. With Skripal, it's MI6. With Navalny, again, it's foreigners or it's nothing. And it's a very depressing cycle, because you see these brave people in Russia who try and report honestly on the state, which has become in the 21st century this dark, stonking kleptocracy under Putin, where he and the people around him are all kind of multi-billionaires. They're the richest group on the planet. But that's their kind of stealthy private project, and the public project is one of unabashed nationalism, nativism, exceptionalism, where Russia is portrayed on state media as a besieged fortress, surrounded by enemies, surrounded by an antipathetic West. And I think one of the reasons I keep writing these books, these nonfiction thrillers, is because Putin keeps going. There's a sort of remorselessness about him. And I did Collusion, which was published in 2017. And really, since then, Sergei Skripal got almost murdered in what was more or less a kind of copycat plot of the Litvinenko case, carried out this time not by the FSB, but by their GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. And my book, Shadow State, begins with the two men who got on a flight from Moscow to London didn't look like assassins. They were dressed inconspicuously in jeans and fleece jackets. Their names were Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bashirov, and so on. And it's this dramatic scene of professional murderers sent by a hostile state arriving in the UK and no one noticing, again, slipping through customs, renting a hotel in the East End of London, going twice to Salisbury by train, once as reconnaissance, the next day smearing Novichok, this lethal nerve agent, on the door handle of Sergei Skripal's rather modest, semi-detached house. I mean, I've seen it. I've sort of been there to kind of report on it. And then escaping. And the mission was both a disaster insofar as they were subsequently caught and identified. But in a way, it didn't really matter, because the message had been sent both to London, a sign of contempt, and to MI6 from Russia, from Putin, to the British political and security establishment, but also, I think more importantly, a message to people in Moscow who were thinking of maybe collaborating with the West, with Western security agencies, that if you betray the motherland, if you talk to the CIA, then there will be a reckoning, that we will catch up with you, and when you've forgotten about us, we will come from behind and we will smash you. It's quite a powerful message. So So basically, I thought, well, I have to write this, and then there's the whole question of Brexit, which I'll talk about in a minute, and kind of Russian influence operations around that, and of course, the whole kind of Trump-Putin relationship in the US, which became more and more blatant and surreal almost. And so Shadow State, I guess that what it's all about is the thesis that the big idea is that what Vladimir Putin is doing, has been doing really quite successfully over the past 2 decades, is to take the methods of the Cold War used by the KGB, the kind of stuff he learned as a junior spy in Leningrad. So sabotage, disinformation, false rumor, blackmail, corruption, trying to kind of influence Western politics to subvert the whole kind of democratic process. He's sort of taken that concept of, it's a Leninist idea really, of war or semi-war, or you might call it unofficial war, quasi-war, with the, in Cold War times, the capitalist West, but now it's just with the West because Russia is capitalist as well. And he's updated it he's taken that Soviet playbook and he's shined it up for our age of social media, for Twitter, for Facebook, with really quite tremendous effect. And so what we see is the same strategic goals from Russia, but with much greater scope. Because in the past, KGB officers would, for example, they would hand out leaflets outside a car factory in Detroit to try and radicalize the American worker. Whereas now you have a group of maybe 100, 150 trolls sitting in an air-conditioned office in St. Petersburg who very successfully in 2015 and 2016 pretended to be Trump-supporting Americans and sent millions of tweets about divisive issues to do with gun control, to do with immigration, to do with Black Lives Matter. And also similarly were doing the same in the UK, pushing Brexit, pushing lurid kind of tales of immigrants doing wrong stuff. So there was a psyops, a kind of psychological component, but there was also a sort of classic espionage component as well. And in both these, I mean, if you look at history, there are certain years where you sort of feel that the kind of destiny of nations, there's a fork in the road. And 2016 was certainly one almighty fork. And the thing is, when talking about Putin, we have to be very careful. I mean, he is not an omnipotent baddie wearing a kind of leather jacket, stroking a cat in a control room in Moscow, flipping red buttons. He's a classic KGB opportunist and adventurist who gets his spy agencies to do operations all over the place, some of which work and some of which fail. And you just move on and you forget about it. And so that was his approach. It's not that, I'm not saying, I don't write that Putin caused Brexit or caused Trump. Clearly there were a whole host of domestic factors, which depending on how far back you want to go, you can go back to 2008, you can go back beyond that. But primarily, these were domestic affairs. But what you have to bear in mind is that Putin was someone who put paraffin on the flames and was pushing in a certain direction. And when you have a 50-50 scenario, like he did with Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton in 2016, and like you had with the Brexit referendum, that kind of Russian intervention may have been decisive. It certainly happened. And I wrote Shadow State partly out of exasperation because in the US, at least, we have had Robert Mueller, whose report came out last year, who spent almost 2 years with the FBI leading a probe into collusion between Trump and Russia. Now, his eventual report was quite disappointing. I write about it in Shadow State. He didn't talk about collusion, which is not a legal concept, but he didn't find a kind of criminal conspiracy. At the same time, he did lay out multiple contacts between Russian spies, intermediaries in the Trump campaign. So that's what we got in the US, a topic that's kind of dominated public discourse there. in the UK, we've had nothing similar at all. We have not had a kind of cross-Whitehall investigation into Russian meddling in British politics. We know of multiple contacts in those kind of crucial months of 2015 and 2016 between Russian career spies, one of whom I write about, called Alexander Udod, a kind of tall young man, a rather charming young man. According to people I've spoken to who know him, I don't know if you can see, but that's him there in the kind of with a cross of St. George at an Oxford college, and he cultivated Aaron Banks, the person behind Leave EU, who donated almost £8.5 million, the biggest nation in British political history, towards Brexit, introduced him to the Russian ambassador, and in a series of secret meetings that voters knew nothing about at the time, Banks was offered gold to invest in Siberian gold mining, then diamonds, then more gold. Now, of course, he denies wrongdoing and says that he never took these deals, but nonetheless, there was an absolute pattern of cultivation. And this particular spy was even at the victory party with Nigel Farage in the summer of 2016 when the Brexit referendum was won. So there's clearly quite a lot that you think might be of interest to MI5, MI6, to the Cabinet Office, and so on. And one group of people that did try and examine some of these issues were the MPs sitting on the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC, led up until the last election by Dominic Grieve, Tory MP. And their Russia report, which featured evidence from Christopher Steele, ex-MI6 agent who did the famous Trump dossier, was ready to roll last October. And of course, as we now know, Boris Johnson suppressed the Russia report. He effectively put it down his sock. So, excuse me one second. And we didn't get it before the last election, and we still didn't get it. And 6, 7, 8 months later, we still hadn't got it. And I think actually the plan, sort of Dominic Cummings' plan, was for us to never get this report. Chris Grayling was brought in to head the ISC, to everyone's amazement, because Grayling, well, I mean, he's not had a stellar career as a minister. He was ambushed. Julian Lewis took over instead. And almost exactly a month ago, we finally got to read this document, which I had hoped, by the way, someone would leak me, but no one did. We don't seem to be a nation of leakers, the British, unlike the Americans who leak all the time. And the Russia report kind of confirmed my worst fears, essentially, that in fact there had been ample warnings from British intelligence professionals, from Christopher Steele, that firstly, Donald Trump may have been compromised by the Russians in various ways. And secondly, that there was tremendous Russian espionage activity in favor of Brexit in 2016. And what you have to understand is that whatever your views on Brexit, whether you're for it or against it, Vladimir Putin was absolutely for it, because he saw it as a way of diminishing the UK politically, economically, militarily, and of harming irrevocably the European Union, which has been his sworn foe, because the world, the sort of nihilistic world that Putin prefers, is one where Russia can make crony-ish deals bilaterally with preferably weaker sovereign states. He hates institutions, much in the same, international institutions, much in the same way that Donald Trump does, and he particularly hates the EU, especially after 2014, when it imposed sanctions on Russia following its annexation of Crimea, and after Moscow really kind of kick-started and armed this conflict in the east of Ukraine, which continues. So clearly there was plenty to examine, but what we learned from the Russia report was that neither Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary nor Theresa May as Prime Minister had wanted to examine this. And the spy agencies who you thought would have looked at this question, like Mueller, were either too kind of timid and cowed and worried about the political aspect, or they were asleep. And so really, strangely, it's actually been left to a sort of small group of journalists and sort of citizen activists and bloggers to try and pursue this story. I mean, you know, Shadow State is kind of my Russia report in a way, or my attempt to set out both in the UK and America and globally, what Russia is doing. And I have to pay tribute to my colleagues. I mean, in particular, Carole Cadwalladr from The Guardian and The Observer, who broke the scandal of Cambridge Analytica, this really malign data computer modeling firm that took 85 million Facebook accounts, very often without people knowing this what was happening, used them, refined them algorithmically, and then micro-targeted swing voters to help Trump and indeed to push Brexit. So Carole did that. She's currently being sued by Arron Banks in the High Court. We'll have to see how that goes. But I sort of think there's been a sort of political failure by most of our politicians and by government. There's been a refusal by Boris Johnson to look at these questions, I think it's troubling, and I think it's short-sighted because, you know, Putin doesn't love Boris Johnson or Brexit. He just sees it as a strategic tool to try and undermine the UK. And I can guarantee that if and when there is a second Scottish referendum, then Putin, his troll army and his spies will push for Scottish secession because they see that as a further blow to the UK. So in that case, it's going to be absolutely against what Downing Street wishes. So I'm going to explore all this. I have a chapter on Bellingcat. For those of you who don't know Bellingcat, they are a rather wonderful group of open source investigators who, these are the people, kids you might call them, who identified the real names of the poisoners of Sergei Skripal, that they're actually called Chupiga and Mishkin. And they have done more damage to Russian spying to the GRU than MI6 and CIA combined. And what's quite interesting about it is that it's not because they're spies, it's because they are younger, nimbler, and they understand the modern world. They understand that anybody, even a career intelligence professional, will leave a trace online, they'll buy a car, or have a telephone record. And what they've done, paradoxically, is they've used the corruption of Russia, the kind of micro-corruption, against the Russian state. So they've bought up databases, they bought passport records on the black market, they bought up all manner of things. And this has enabled them to carry out Pulitzer Prize-winning investigations, in my view, and also working with very good collaborative journalists in Russia, one of whom, for example, went to the home village practically in the Arctic Circle where one of these Skripal killers lived with, or used to live with, his grandmother, and found the grandmother and discovered that she had a portrait on her mantelpiece of Mishkin, the murderer or the would-be murderer, shaking hands with Vladimir Putin and being given a major state honor. And what's interesting is that I'm in my early 50s, and I don't know how old you are, my lovely audience, but probably most of you will remember All the President's Men, the classic Watergate movie featuring Woodward and Bernstein, with two intrepid reporters pounding the streets of America, knocking on doors with sideburns, burning shoe leather. But actually, the Woodward and Bernstein of our age these days, it's not that. It's a young kid sitting in front of a MacBook Air like the one I've got in front of me here, with a skinny cappuccino, you know, searching an obscure database for a fact which will nail the bad guys. So our world has moved on. And I'll just say one last thing before I hand back to Cheryl to take some of your questions, which is that I'm kind of disturbed by the direction the world is going in. I mean, I know that sounds perhaps like a truism, and obviously we've got Donald Trump speaking shortly at the Republican National Convention. It's quite possible he may win again. We don't know, and we can see the turmoil, the racial divisions, the hyper-partisanship, the strife, the carnage being played out nightly on American streets. and it doesn't look very appealing. But I just worry about that kind of Trumpian sensibility being carried over into our own politics with the rise of Dominic Cummings, with the politicization of the civil servants, of the civil service, with the fact that so many permanent secretaries are being dumped out, apparently for holding the wrong views or to cover up for ministerial failings. And I also worry, above all, about Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party more broadly and their kind of relationship with Russia. Now, you have to acknowledge that all parties have, or people from all parties have taken Russian cash in the past, including Labour, MPs and peers. Peter Mandelson was on the board until a couple of years ago of a big Moscow conglomerate earning, about £200,000 a year. But what we've seen in the last few years is we've seen really a concerted effort by Russian spies in London to cultivate the kind of Eurosceptic faction of the Conservative Party and the sort of pro-Leave people who are now in Downing Street. And we've seen really huge donations from people who are formerly British. They've had a passport for 4 or 5 years, quite often non-doms, but with links to Moscow, with property in Moscow, giving £1, £2, £3 million to the party. And just the last thing that I find super curious is the odd tale of the Lebedevs, Yevgeny Lebedev and Alexander Lebedev. Now, Alexander Lebedev, in 2009, I had lunch with him and he told me rather nonchalantly over a plate of pasta with octopus that he was buying the Evening Standard newspaper the next day. He was a KGB officer in the late 1980s and early 90s. He served in the KGB's first directorate, specializing in foreign intelligence. He was based at the then Soviet embassy in Kensington. And then he had a kind of very successful career. And he says that he bought the Standard and then the Independent because he wanted to kind of altruistically help these distressed industries. But what we've really seen over the last few years is we've seen Yevgeny has cultivated the whole of British theatrical society. He has these wild hedonistic parties in London and Italy, full of A-list actors, and also attended by one Boris Johnson, who keeps on going to these parties, stays quite late, I'm told. And in April of 2018, 2 weeks after Sergei Skripal got poisoned, when Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he told his security detail to take the weekend off, which is highly unusual. You're not supposed to do that. Flew to Italy and stayed for the weekend at Johnson's mansion in Perugia. And we don't know what happened there. Johnson won't say. He was photographed by a Guardian reader flying home the next day, looking very disheveled and hungover in a kind of crumpled suit. And I asked Alexander last autumn whether he'd seen Boris Johnson there. He told me he hadn't. Subsequently in Moscow, at his book launch about a month later, he told someone else that he was there, in fact. And I find this troubling if you put it all together. I'm not suggesting that Boris Johnson is a Russian asset. I think he's a far more robust figure than, say, Donald Trump, who I think you might argue is a Russian asset to some degree, albeit a kind of unwitting one whose treason, if you can call it that, just flows from amoralism and stiffing people over his long career, whether it's the Inland Revenue Service or contractors and so on. But what I'm troubled by is I think Moscow probably knows more about Boris Johnson than we do. Clearly, he's a target for surveillance. I think these large mega donations to the Conservative Party are curious. And I find the fact that we haven't had a full investigation into Russian interference in our politics really quite disturbing. And so what I've done, I hope, is to try and pull this all together in a thrilling, page-turning book with sort of a kind of filmic aspect to it to explain our tough times. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Luke. That's absolutely fascinating, and we're all going to dying to read the book. I've got some absolutely amazing questions here, so really interesting. Okay, the first one from Joe. What did you make of the Russian report and why it took so long to release?
Well, thanks, Joe. Well, I mean, some of that we have covered, I think, but not all of it. One thing we have to understand is we only got some of the Russia report. I mean, I read it very carefully, and in quite a lot of crucial places, there are sort of asterisks. So, for example, there's a wonderful bit where the MPs talk about the UK becoming Londongrad, that there's been dirty money washing through the capital since the 90s, so much dirty money, it's impossible to get rid of it. And it says business and politics are intertwined, and then asterisks, 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 which is kind of terrifically frustrating. But what it does say is that there's a whole class of professionals in this country, lawyers, real estate guys, private school headmasters, even former intelligence officers, retired spooks, who are and PR people who are hired by Russian oligarchs or Russian interests to do things. Now, we have to be clear, Joe, that not all these people are bad actors. Some of them are okay, but many of them have got links to the Kremlin and actually advance. This is what the report says: advance the Kremlin's agenda as well as their own. And I think this is kind of quite painful for Johnson. Quite a few of his friends are in that subgroup. And the other thing, just about redactions, is that there's also a secret annex to the Russia report, which we haven't seen. So there's the public bit redacted, 50 pages. And then there's another bit, one would hope, including some stuff from the security services who gave evidence from MI5, MI6. By the way, if anyone has it, please leak it to me. I mean, I know I was saying early on that no one leaks stuff anymore, but there are a few brave people out there. So if you have it, do not send electronically, but put it in a brown envelope and post it to me at The Guardian. That's more secure than anything electronic. But I imagine what's in there is stuff, sort of named people, including, I suspect, the Lebedevs. I don't know, I can't prove that. They may deny it. And including people like Lyubov Chernukin, who's given £3 million to the Tories, who's British, but from Moscow, and her husband just happens to be Vladimir Putin's former deputy finance minister, and so on. So we haven't got to the bottom of the story, and the key thing, as the MPs made clear when they released this on July the 3rd, is that no one in government asked the question, that they ran away from it. Like they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot barge pole, was the quote that we got.
Mm. Okay, Meg Klein says, and now you have to excuse my pronunciation, Prigozhin?
Prigozhin, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, what is it?
Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Navalny and the 88 million ruble debt that's conveniently surfaced. Seems like Prigozhin just being an opportunist, but do you think there's anything more Kremlin organised to the Prigozhin threatening Navalny and family so publicly?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, Prigozhin is he's a billionaire thug, and he's not just a billionaire thug. He's Vladimir Putin's billionaire thug. And I have a whole chapter about him. I mean, it's actually a great question. It's an astonishing story. I mean, it's called East India Company because basically Prigozhin was a criminal in what was then Leningrad in the 1980s. He used to go around mugging young ladies and stealing their fur coats and earrings, and he got caught. He did break-ins. He spent 8 years in jail. Then he got out of jail just as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and at a time when, in fact, everybody was stealing. So he was just ahead of the curve. And then he became a seller of hot dogs. He was letting, St. Petersburg's first hot dog seller. And then, thanks to his shadowy contacts, he went into restaurants. He bought a floating boat, turned it into an upmarket restaurant. One of his early customers was someone called Vladimir Putin, who just happened to be deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And then suddenly all of the other shadowy security types, politicians, gangsters, who were more or less indistinguishable, they started coming to the restaurant. And by the noughties, Prigozhin became a formidably powerful figure in his own right. He was known as Putin's chef because he literally served the food to Putin whenever Putin came to dine. Putin took George Bush, by the way, to this floating boat for a meal. And what Prigozhin has done latterly has been the sort of special projects guy. And what's been really fascinating is the Kremlin has outsourced strategic intelligence operations to Prigozhin. So it's Prigozhin who ran and funded the Troll Factory that we saw in the US and in the UK in 2016 and indeed subsequently. And he also runs a sort of really sketchy outfit of mercenaries called Wagner, which is basically sort of former Russian soldiers who are, they're off the books, but essentially they're linked with Russian military defense structures, and they have been all over the world. They fought in Ukraine, they've been in Syria, they're in Libya at the moment, and they've more or less captured the Central African Republic. And so I write all about this, and I call the chapter East India Company because that's the model. There's a quote from Edmund Burke talking about the East India Company, which describes the East India Company as the state in the guise of a merchant. And that is what Prigozhin is. He's in the guise of a merchant, but actually he's the state. And so when Prigozhin sues Navalny for $1.2 million, that's not an outraged and unhappy citizen. That is Putin taking a man who is possibly mortally ill, lying in a coma in a hospital in Berlin, and further rubbing his face in it. I mean, it's just the sort of thuggishness of these guys cannot be overstated. There's a kind of cruelty about them, which is both awful and petty. It's not the gigantic tyranny of Stalin. It's the micro tyranny of a group of KGB guys who find out your most vulnerable spot and then exploit it.
Mm. Oh, any thoughts on the Russian SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, especially since Russia is now saying Belarus will be first to join the phase 3 testing? Given the situation in Belarus at present, that sounds more like a threat than a promise, says Meg.
Well, it's funny you say that. So my colleague Sean Walker he's done some wonderful reporting from Belarus. I mean, really the best stuff that I've seen. He was there for 2 weeks. He left a couple of days ago. We swapped messages yesterday on Google Chat. He just got back from Belarus and quite tired, quite exhilarated. And the first thing he did is to go and take a COVID test because he says there's no social distancing in Belarus at all. I mean, no one's wearing a mask. The concept doesn't exist. And so I don't know what the result is. But I mean, I would say two things about the vaccine. First of all, you have to acknowledge that Russia still, despite the general degradation that's afflicted politics, universities, scholarship, institutional life, education, in Russia, there are some very talented scientists still, and they tend to flourish and do best when they leave, and then they're hugely successful. I mean, there's an absolutely brilliant Russian kind of educated class, and my books, and I just want to make this clear, they're not sort of directed against Russia. I'm not a Russophobe. I mean, I love Russia. I mean, I still have Russian lessons with my adorable teacher on Sunday via Skype. So we can read literature together, Bunin or Dostoevsky or Dovlatov or Pushkin or whoever. But the problem is the state and the toxic people who work there. And maybe this vaccine is okay. I mean, clearly they haven't done phase 3 trials. And the reason I think it may work is that the elites genuinely have taken it. All of the VIPs have inoculated themselves and their elderly parents already. So, so when I say all, we're talking about, the top 500, 1,000 people. Vladimir Putin says his daughter has had it. I don't know. So, I mean, they're clearly confident that it's not going to kill you. Whether it's a genuinely effective cure, or I don't know. I mean, maybe it takes the edge off it. We're not sure. But the problem is that because Putin basically, I mean, he's a sort of grandmaster in lying. He lies about everything all the time. It's what he was trained to do in the KGB, and he doesn't see anything immoral about it. He just sees it as a strategic thing to do. But because Russia lies all the time, it means that when it comes to things like vaccines, it's got zero credibility. And so I don't see, there may be take up from the developing world, but I don't see much take up from Europe or from the UK.
Mm. Okay, Paul Treadwell says, great talk, thank you. With a number of critics dying, being attacked, do you have fears, concerns about your own safety?
Thank you, Paul. I mean, I always get the kind of why aren't you not dead? Why aren't you dead? Question. It normally comes a little later in the evening, but
Sorry.
Paul,
In.
Paul is right on trend. So, I mean, there is an answer to this. And the strange thing is, after my slightly weird experience in Moscow, where I had sort of unpromising young men following me around in leather jackets from the FSB, and my phone being bugged and my laptop being hacked, and whenever I made a joke about Putin, the line being cut and getting on the phone, all of that crazy stuff, which was sort of sub John le Carre. I mean, I do have some understanding, not just into their methods, but also how they think. And perversely, that helps me because essentially they decided fairly early on, for reasons that are still mysterious to me, that I was a kind of scruffy, left-wing version of James Bond. You know, that I was, you know, I was writing stories for The Guardian, but really I was working undercover, taking instructions from the Foreign Office, and that my goal was to defame Vladimir Putin. Or I don't know what fantasy they constructed, but the thing is, that's actually quite helpful because they have one rule for traitors that we see, that we've seen in Salisbury, that we've seen in London, that we've seen in Tomsk. And they have another rule for foreign spies. So I was in the kind of literary foreign spy category. And so that means that they, you know, they troll me all the time. I get kind of, you know, I get kind of fake troll messages. They get their sort of useful idiot proxies in America to write abusive stuff about me. I get, if you look at the reviews for Shadow State, they're all basically 5-star, apart from a few written in really bad English, saying, you know, this author, he hates Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump, good guy. I mean, it's quite crude, but obviously it pushes your rating down. But that's okay. My phone gets hacked about once a year. I have to get a new phone. And, you know, I got a phishing email from the GRU of the same kind sent to the DNC, to the Democrats in 2016, which was also sent to Bellingcat, to Elian Higgins. We all got the same email. And I wasn't suckered by it. So there's kind of this sort of petty harassment, but unless the rules have changed, and of course it is possible the rules will change. These are kind of Cold War rules. I can't think of any foreign journalist who's been killed. I mean, there have been plenty who've been deported. I mean, I was the first, but others subsequently have been refused entry or kicked out or whatever. But so, I mean, I think probably the final straw, if there were to be a final straw, would be, if you see behind me, there's a poster from the Old Vic Theatre. I don't know if anyone caught the show, but by Lucy Prebble, whose new show, I Hate Susie, starts tonight, by the way, on Sky. But, you know, we had a Putin character on stage played by Reece Shearsmith, who was hilarious, short, camp, Mr. President, made the most seductively evil, awful speeches and kind of mocked. And I wondered whether we would get a bomb threat, whether they would try and do something to the theatre. But actually, you know, the show was a sellout. It's up for an Olivier, except the Oliviers have been postponed for a year for Best New Play. And I sort of think now, maybe complacently, that things will be all right. But having said all that, like I said before, the heroes in this story are Navalny and people like him, because for them it's a whole set of different rules, and the you know, what can happen to you is nothing to nerve agent. That's the spectrum.
So Meg says, what can average citizens on both sides of the Atlantic do to get better at identifying and avoiding Russian disinformation?
Well, read my book as a start. Read the Russia Report. Read, actually, maybe don't read all of it because it's 1,000 pages long. But last week we got a report by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which had been investigating Russia from a counterintelligence perspective for almost 3 years. And what was interesting is it went further than the Mueller report, in that it said explicitly that someone else I write about in Shadow State, called Konstantin Kilimnik, who was basically Paul Manafort's best friend, Paul Manafort being Trump's campaign manager in 2016, that Kilimnik was a Russian intelligence officer. And it was a really interesting document. It reprises what we knew, that Manafort and Kilimnik were communicating through encrypted channels. They had 8 different apps. They were doing something called foldering, which is they had a secret email account where they would have a draft. So the email was never sent. They would both go into it and add to the draft, which is quite a sophisticated espionage technique. Manafort was giving Kilimnik, so the GRU, real-time intelligence about the Trump campaign, sensitive polling data, telling Moscow what was happening in the Rust Belt states, which in the end did it for Trump, and so on. There was a Russian spy at the heart of the Trump campaign. So read all that stuff. And I would say, thank you for coming to events like this, because it's only these kind of gatherings where we can kind of talk honestly and ask questions that we can pump air into the system. It's so important. And I would just say one other thing, which is do support Carole Cadwalladr if you can. I mean, she's crowd raising. If you have a tenner, give her a tenner. If you don't like her tweets, but she's trying to raise money for her libel action against Arron Banks, and she's founded an initiative called All the Citizens, which basically is demanding greater transparency from our politicians, an investigation into Russian meddling, and is a sincere grassroots attempt to try and preserve the integrity of our elections, because we're in this cacophonous world where there are so many dark forces. It's Russia today, but it could be China tomorrow or someone else the day after, who are in quite sophisticated ways trying to subvert our politics and our democracy.
Keaton Bart says, what possible reason can Facebook, Twitter have to gain from allowing their platform to be abused by bots to help Russia, and the refusal to do anything about it?
Well, it's unfortunately it's money. I mean, Twitter has been slightly better insofar as they have at least started branding Donald Trump's tweets as being kind of false information when he's been spreading untruths about coronavirus, about mailing fraud, and so on. The real villain is Facebook. I mean, I'm reading a book at the moment by Christopher Wiley, who was the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. It's called Mindfuck, and it's actually, I started reading it sort of thinking I wouldn't get through it, but it's actually really compelling, and it's just this astonishing insider account as to how Robert Mercer, an extremely right-wing billionaire, pumped in 20 million into Cambridge Analytica, introduced Steve Bannon, and used this data set like a kind of nuclear bomb, basically, to just blow apart American politics and American norms. So, sorry, tell me the question again. I'm such a rapture of Chris Wiley's book.
Okay, so what reason can Facebook and Twitter gain from allowing their platform to be abused by bots?
So the point is that Facebook just makes billions of dollars. I mean, it's hugely profitable. And they say we're not a publisher, we are just a platform for other people to publish. And it's just not defensible. I mean, Facebook has more power than a nation state. I mean, Carol did a memorable. She did a memorable kind of address to Silicon Valley, where she basically called out Mark Zuckerberg and said, essentially, free elections are becoming impossible because of what you're doing. And it's just incredibly irresponsible when we're surrounded by lies, and a political class, I have to say, to some extent in this country as well, but obviously the Trump administration, that will lie and lie and lie and lie. And yet Facebook allows all this stuff to be kind of promulgated. Now, I believe in free speech. Of course, we can't all agree. The world would be dull if we did. But there has to be a modicum of fact-checking, and there has to be an attempt to stop state-level disinformation, which is what happened in 2016, and Facebook didn't notice, and then denied it for a long time, and then threatened to sue Carole Cadwalladr, and then Zuckerberg made a kind of semi-apologetic appearance on Capitol Hill. He refuses to testify for the British Parliament, and then Nick Clegg goes to work for him. What the hell? Sorry, Nick Clegg fans out there, but I used to quite like Nick Clegg, but what happened there? And has become his sort of chief spin doctor. I mean, what a fool! What a fool!
Okay. Back in March, the US State Department paid Kirill Dmitriev a sizable sum for broken and substandard medical equipment and PPE as part of the ill-fated Operation Airbridge. Does this strike you as plain old whatever gift is handy will do from both sides, or should we be concerned that the US government's first port of call in a crisis was one of Russia's money laundering operations?
Yes and yes. I mean, I don't know who made money from that, but someone will have done. I mean, it clearly wasn't in the interest of the kind of ailing American uh, population. But Kirill Dmitriev is a curious figure. He runs Russia's main sovereign wealth fund. He was corresponding with various Trump people in the run-up to the vote. He was mysteriously in New York in November 2016 when Trump won. Subsequently, Eric Prince, who's a kind of a Trump supporter and a contractor, had a secret meeting with Dmitriev in the Seychelles. Dmitriev is also someone who gave an interview to the FT recently and said that he had given the COVID vaccine, the Russian COVID vaccine, to his elderly parents. So, I mean, he's one of these kind of classic intermediaries. I mean, he formally he's not the Russian state, but of course he's the Russian state, and almost certainly he's kind of ex-intelligence, because all of these people are, or intelligence. And yeah, I mean, I've had two goes at writing the story of Donald Trump and Russia, one collusion, one shadow state. I'm not going to write a third book, regardless of whether he wins or not in November. But we're going to need a kind of post-Trump regime or post-Trump administration to get to the bottom of this, because, you know, just to say very quickly, neither Mueller nor the Senate nor anybody else has followed the money. And to understand Trump, I mean, yes, there's compromise. Yes, I'm sure. I was filmed in my bedroom in Moscow by the FSB. Of course, Trump will have been filmed in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 2013. Of course, there's a tape. Probably these guys snickered it, you know, privately at home. We'll never see it. It's not going to be on a bookshop Zoom webinar anytime soon. But ultimately, it's about the money. It's all about the money, and East European money has been propping up Trump since the mid-1980s, and he's been a major conduit for Moscow money laundering. That's why he's so appealing. You know, I've heard stories of people literally turning up with $3 million in cash, putting it on his desk, and then buying a condominium from Trump.
So what do you think of the Western media's biggest blind spots? What should be getting more coverage and isn't, says Meg.
Is that Meg?
Meg, sorry, yeah. Meg Klein.
Meg. Oh, Meg is, go Meg. Meg's hyperactive this evening.
Yes, she is. She's
it's a really good question, Meg. I think, I mean, just as a foreign correspondent in Moscow, by the way, I loved it, apart from all the dark stuff. One of the problems is, because it's such a fast-moving story, and you have these kind of outsized sort of cynics doing things from inside the Kremlin, I didn't get enough to go enough to Russia's provinces. I mean, they're vibrant, they're interesting, they are heterodox, there are all sorts of things going on. From I did fly once to Kamchatka on the world's longest internal flight. It was 12 hours from Moscow to the Pacific coast of Russia to do a piece about salmon poaching. But it's a brilliant country of 145 million people, which goes from subtropical Sochi to the Arctic Circle to the Pacific, you know, with its sort of handful of tigers that are left. And with a great culture, great music, great theatre. And I think I didn't write enough about the non-politics. And I would just say that, I mean, I stressed this earlier on, just to disassociate Putin from Russia. It's a brilliant country. I would urge people to visit it. Maybe not holding shadow state, leave that at home, but just to kind of experience it. I mean, it's genuinely great, but Putin conflates sort of greatness with forced projection and forced solutions, and with threat and with menace and with meddling. I mean, it can be great without that, but we're going to have to wait a long time, because Putin just won a constitutional referendum and is going to be in power, or at least potentially in power, until 2036, by which time, you know, I will be grayer, and we'll all be grayer, I guess, and probably Boris Johnson and Donald Trump will be gone, but Putin will still be.
There's sort of two questions, actually, sort of very similar, one from Paul and one from Anonymous. But anyway, basically saying, what's the end game for Putin and the future?
Well, I mean, Russia really is it's a form of stagnation, similar to, I don't know how old my audience is, but similar to the 1970s under Leonid Brezhnev, where the sort of Soviet state had just gone into a kind of cul-de-sac and didn't really go anywhere. It's a lovely word in Russian, it's zastoy, stagnation, and it's similar. I mean, living standards have gone down. Russia has, you know, tremendous oil and gas reserves, but so much is stolen by the elite. There isn't very much trickle down. There's still no proper road between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Can you believe it? There's massive systemic corruption everywhere, from the corridors of the Kremlin to try and get your kid into nursery school, to health treatment, to university admission. And the state is sort of failing. It doesn't really kind of function in the way that a government should. And so there's tremendous frustration. And we've seen protests. We saw big protests in 2011, 2012. And obviously the scenario that Putin is terrified about is the Belarus scenario, where you have kind of mass uprising. And he'll do everything in his power to squash Belarus. He would do the same in Russia. And I think Navalny's poisoning may be linked to Belarus. But also, so many people are bound into this system. There's a security force, intelligence agencies, millions of people on state salaries who have been co-opted. And in a way, corruption is the glue that binds everybody together. And if everybody is corrupt, then if they want to get rid of you, they can accuse you of corruption. And if you're clean, like Alexander Litvinenko, then you get persecuted and ultimately, in his case, murdered. So I don't see any post-Putin world anytime soon. I think it will come, but whether I'm around to see it, whether I'm on a Zimmer frame, I don't know. I mean, the only consoling thing I'd say is that we do live in an era of fast history and fast time. Putin isn't immortal, much as he would like to be, and very strange things can happen from nowhere in Russia.
Okay, last question from Meg, and she says, thanks very much for your time, Luke. Regarding the US elections in November, how worried should we be about Russian interference might evolve for 2020? Specifically, do you think the Russians will rerun their 2016 playbook, or would they risk actually flipping vote totals to keeping Trump in power?
Meg, that's such a good question. Thanks for your pin-sharp questions all evening. I mean, we don't know. In a way, Trump was fated in Moscow as the kind of greatest espionage success in Russian and Soviet history, and it's been mission accomplished for 4 years. I mean, he's taken America to a place of isolationism. He's inflamed what looks from the outside like a sort of, I would say, a cold civil war, but with hot flashes in the US. And he's estranged Washington from its traditional transatlantic allies, from the Europeans, from Merkel, from Berlin, from Paris. So obviously they want to keep him there, but I think their play may be slightly more subtle. I think if Trump loses, it's possible they will hack. Maybe they hack to help Joe Biden, right? And then Trump loses and says, look, Biden cheated, and the Democrats say there's no proof. And then they go, oh, look, here's the proof. And actually, it's the Russians who've done it, but in the cacophony of Fox News, who would pay attention. And the idea is to discredit American democracy. And I'm really fearful about what will happen in November if Trump loses. Will he accept defeat and exit, or will he claim that he won anyway? The Democrats cheated, and then try and use the Supreme Court to enact some kind of constitutional coup. I mean, I don't know. We don't know. I mean, I think Joe Biden has to win big. But either way, Russia can sit back and watch the flames burning, or it can try and do a hacking and dumping operation. I mean, it's quite possible they're sitting on something from Ukraine that's already been hacked about Joe Biden, and they try and bring back the whole kind of fake Biden scandal from Ukraine, and they launch that in October or next week or in 2 weeks' time, so that it just feeds the frenzy. I don't know, but Biden is fighting both Trump and Russia, so it's a huge battle. And I just, the very last thing I'd say is that I have to say, just talking to you, doing this event, getting these super smart questions does give me hope. I mean, I always feel mildly demoralized, and then I have a conversation like this, great audience, and I kind of feel uplifted. And I sort of think, in a way, the darker it gets, the more we have to kind of fight for, actually. And I don't mean fight in any martial sense. I just mean in terms of discussing, reading, thinking, being alive to the moment. And so, yeah, thanks very much. It's been lovely to chat with you.
Okay, so there's one more question. Is that all right?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah,
going over just to some balance. Okay, Ruben, a question from him. May have covered it. Are not Russia's actions the same as tactics used by the US and the UK over the last 40 to 50 years, expanding their sphere of influence, manipulating local politics, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Ruben. It's a fair question. I mean, I think certainly historically that's been true. I mean, during the Cold War, the CIA and the KGB faced off in a number of countries, including Chile, where we know what the CIA did there, including Cuba, including Iran, where MI6 CIA removed the democratically elected prime minister in a coup. There's a new documentary film about that which has just come out. And the Russians were doing the same. I mean, the KGB were absolutely doing the same thing. They were covertly funding Western communist parties, including countries like France and Italy, also in the US to less effect. And there was a struggle where subversion took place on both sides. I mean, what I would say, and I'm in no way trying to apologize for Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the kind of disasters there, which I think is a slightly separate subject, is that I'm not sure that either the UK or certainly the US in kind of its kind of Obama incarnation was still doing that in the noughties, what that Tony Blair was, that we were trying to subvert elections elsewhere. I mean, certainly there were pro-democracy initiatives going on, capacity building, election observers trying to help fledgling democratic parties in the 1990s in former Eastern Europe, for example. But I don't think US, UK have done anything comparable to what Russia has been doing, which is really to try and create chaos on a global scale and to subvert elections all over the place. I mean, in my kind of Prigozhin chapter, I mean, Prigozhin's political operatives, they go to places that no one cares about. When I say no one, I mean sort of in a flippant way, but London and Washington, they go to Madagascar, try and influence elections in Madagascar. They, not successfully, but they're trying everywhere. Central African Republic, who cares about that? Well, Russia now has military bases there. The president's advisor is a former Russian spy, etc. The president is guided by Russian security guards. There's a kind of global ambition there, which, because we're beset with our own woes, I don't think we have. And I'm not sure. Just the last difference I would say is that, despite James Bond, if the one thing we've learned about MI6 these days is they're pretty timid, right? I mean, if they can't actually investigate Russian election interference, or Russian interference in British politics, I think it's unlikely they would organize trained killers to go roaming around other countries to kill people. I don't see it. I don't see anything analogous to what the GRU is doing with critics of Boris Johnson being poisoned or felled in the same way. So I would hope that our democracy still functions. I'm kind of worried about it, but for now we live in a democracy, and we need to cherish that, because a lot of people don't have it.
Thank you, Luke. That's absolutely brilliant. And there's comments coming in on the chat line thanking you for an absolutely fascinating talk. So don't forget the book, you've all got it, but loads of copies, signed copies available in the shop. So on that note, we'll leave you. Thank you so much, Luke, and keep safe.
Cheryl, thank you. If anyone wants to leak me anything, do get in touch. I'm really on the market. So if you know anybody who will leak stuff.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll keep a lookout. Cheerio.
Okay,
thanks ever so much. Fantastic talk. Loads of comments coming in on the chat. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, it's a pleasure. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.